Professor John Baily, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. I'm very
My pleasure.
excited.
My pleasure.
So I just want to start way back in the early days of your time in Afghanistan. I want to know what initially made you go to Afghanistan, specifically Herat, where you spent a number of years studying and working and living amongst the people.
Well, I have to make it clear that I come from a very musical lineage. My father, who was a lawyer, was also mad about music and played many different instruments during my many years of upbringing, from the piano to the guitar to the ukulele to all sorts of other things. So I have that kind of musical background. I'm sure is, partly responsible for what I've been doing with my life. And I was at university, Oxford University, to do a degree in experimental psychology, which I did rather badly. And but all the time I was very interested in the blues and being a blues singer. And I had a band at Oxford called the King Cobra and the Rattlesnakes. And one of the members of that band and I, we decided that we were both finishing at the same time. We would like to go to Australia to see overland, and we drove not all the way to Australia, but most of the way. And we passed through many different places. We had a car radio, so we were listening to music from all the different countries that we were driving through. And we didn't know much about Afghanistan, but when we got there, we really felt, in love with the place very easily. I'm just going to show you a little photo here. This is the ancient fortress in the middle of Herat,
Mhm.
associated with, a whole a dynasty of very successful and educated people, 500 years before and so on. It seemed to be a town that was out of time. There were very few motor vehicles on the road. It was a busy city, but it was all horse-drawn traps and so on. It was like a step into another world. So it made a deep impression on me. We proceeded in our way to Australia and worked there for a bit, and then we took another boat to Panama and went and got another car and drove all the way up in the States. Visited some blues singers in Chicago, Howling Wolf in particular, I remember. Anyway, having then started and finished my PhD in experimental psychology, I I was getting interested in Indian music, and one of the instruments that I'd seen being played, this comes up perhaps a bit later, in Afghanistan was this instrument called the dutar, which means the two strings. Here it is. This is the Herati dutar. You can't see it all there, but my only experience of Afghan music at that time was being in tea houses, and sometimes somebody would be playing this kind of instrument. So during my doctoral studies, I started to get very interested in Indian music, and also I started to listen to recordings of music from Afghanistan and thinking how interesting this was. After that, um, I drove again um, towards India, and this time I ended up in Nepal, and I spent 7 months in Nepal, and I was playing the guitar, trying to develop a sort of Indian style or whatever, and I had the extraordinary good fortune to to become the friend of a young, very talented sitar player, a Nepalese sitar player. Narendra Bataju was his name, and he taught me a lot of stuff, and also we did a lot of playing together, sitar and guitar, and so on. And he reappears at various stages in my life later on because um, he moved to Paris and became very well known as a sitar player over there. Anyway, so this is how I um, um, became interested in Eastern music and returned to the UK, and I started to hear about something called ethnomusicology, and I came across the recordings of this dutar type of instrument made by Professor Mark Slobin, who I think you've been in touch with, and I really liked this music and thought, I'd like to know more about it. I then heard that a famous ethnomusicologist had just been appointed as the professor of anthropology in the Queen's University of Belfast. And I went over to see him, and he'd done all his field work in Africa on African music. But he liked my ideas about playing these instruments, and together we started writing grant proposals. And a year later, I was successful in getting a 3-year grant to go to Afghanistan with my wife, Veronica, to work with the Herati dutar. So
Mhm.
that was the beginning of it all.
I want to know what struck you most about the relationships that Afghans in Afghanistan had with music in their daily life.
I mean, music was a highly contentious subject. People, were loved music, liked music, but they were very nervous about music, and it had to be only performed really legitimately in particular situations, mostly at wedding parties. Music was for weddings. And there was a very interesting connection between being a professional musician and being a hairdresser, which was a lowly craft. And being a musician was also a lowly craft. You might be essential for the wedding party, but in general, the musicians were regarded with some kind of nervousness because music was their way of life, and music was a dangerous subject.
Um, Music was still important to them, though. It sounded different in each province, and they still, I find through my conversations with professors and musicians and scholars, that they still manage to hold on to it in its traditional essence, even though
Well,
it's performed in secrecy and privacy and sort of away from the stage and limelight.
okay, all right. Well, uh, we have to distinguish really between in places like Herat, between the local folk music, and
Mm,
that's where the dutar comes in, and also more sophisticated, let's call it that, music that had developed in the court, the royal court in
mhm.
Kabul in the late 19th century, when a number of Indian trained musicians became court musicians there. So there was a strong emphasis on that much more uh, educated kind of music existing in Afghanistan. And some of the musicians that I came across or met in Herat, they were over to Herat to give concerts, particularly in the month of fasting, Muharram. One might think, it's not a month of mourning, but it's a time where in the evening when you can eat again and you go to a concert. And so in Herat, experienced very early when we started doing the field work, these sort of Ramadan concerts and performed by visiting Kabuli musicians. They were Afghan musicians, but they were over because that they were more skilled in this kind of art music end of things. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a kind of continuum really between highly educated and extremely sophisticated music that one could think of as being close to Indian music, and a much rougher and readier kind of local music that was really vocal music accompanied by instruments like the dutar.
What was it like for you to learn music and be in environments where traditions were passed on from generation to generation? And how did those musicians view you in those environments?
Well, there was a very clear distinction between professional musicians and amateur musicians. And amateur musicians, rather kept their love of music to themselves, to their own families, and so on. And I remember one or two instances where uh, a musician would describe how his father, my father, he would say, my father played the dutar. He wasn't a professional dutar player. He liked to play the dutar. But when I started sort of taking the dutar off the wall and playing it myself, he broke the instrument. He destroyed the instrument because he didn't want the neighbors to be thinking that I was training my son to be a musician. Being a musician had a very low status, and that's the connection also with hairdressing, being a barber, and so on. So that meant that professional musicians in a place like Herat were mostly, not all, but mostly from families whose main occupation was hairdressing, male hairdressing. But when the need for music was there for a wedding or whatever, then off they would go. Not playing those musicians, not usually playing the dutar, but playing something called the sorna, a wind instrument, very loud instrument, and there would be wedding processions and so on. I sort of that in many ways. So music was, a highly sensitive area. And if you don't want the neighbors to think that I'm training my son to be a musician, then I'll break the instrument. I came across this several times.
Mm. And how did those musicians view you wanting to learn and wanting to listen and being in those environments?
You mean to me?
Yes. What did
Well,
they?
well, they were very happy, because here's a foreigner coming along, and he's interested in this kind of dubious art that we were occupied with. I had, several very good teachers. Let me just add one little thing here. One of the attractions about Herat that I heard about before I even got there was Mark Slobin had described a new kind of dutar that had developed quite recently. Just to show you an example, this is the two-string dutar, and I better show you the rubab as well. Here's the rubab. This is the national instrument of Afghanistan.
Right.
Just this instrument is very close to originally to Indian music,
Mhm.
and as you can see, it's got all these extra pegs along here, which are tuned to the scale that you're playing in. So Mark Mark Sobin had observed that a new form of dutar had been developed. Where is that? I put it out. So that instrument turned into this instrument, and you can see it also has all these extra strings along with pegs along the side of the neck, and I thought this was a really interesting phenomenon, this transformation. And a lot of my early research was directed to just, finding out more about how that had happened. And it turned out there have been a, uh, a long story, um, a dutar player called Karim Dutari. And he had been sent at about the age of 18. He played the dutar and he was sent off to Kabul for some higher education, go to a better school there. And it was his friends in Kabul from the school suggested that he should go to the radio station and try and play on the radio, which he did. And there was tremendous enthusiasm from the audience who were telephoning the radio station. Who's this? What's this new instrument? And so on. It's the two-string dutar at that time. And so he was invited back, and eventually he became the dutar player in the radio orchestra in Kabul. And he is the person who started adding all these extra strings to the instrument. He was saying, there were a number of different instruments there, but nobody could hear me. I just had two strings, and my instrument wasn't sophisticated in the way that this rubab is. So he was one of the people that I worked with. I mean, having worked in the radio station for 10, 15 years, he then returned to Herat, and he became one of my teachers. And another teacher I had, Gadar Mohammed, really taught me a lot. And he was not from a musician background, but he was a very good player of this 14-stringed dutar, and he was a professional musician when I knew him.
I want to know, how common is it for a researcher like yourself to devote so much time to learning these instruments?
Well, that's what I wanted to do. I loved music. I was a very keen guitar player and so on, and so playing these things was a lot of fun. It wasn't a task. It wasn't a chore. I really enjoyed it. I felt somehow whatever this musical bit of me was in life was having an opportunity for full expression.
Mm.
I have to mention here also that how much I owe to my wife, Veronica, who was with me all this time in Herat, and she became very interested in the in the singing of domestic singing of women. So it turned out that the women had a whole repertoire of songs for nursing the children and so on. And she started to learn these. She was a very good singer anyway, and she was quick to learn. And by the end of our time there, I have to tell you this story. Um, she became the student, if that's the right term, of one of the leading women singers. Sorry, should clarify this. The male musicians only played in male audiences, but for women's wedding parties and so on, then you have female groups, singer playing the harmonium, the small harmonium, and tabla drums, and the frame drum. Okay, and these women's groups were, a singular feature of musical life in Herat. And Veronica started learning from one particular Zainab Herawi was her teacher's name,
Mhm.
and Veronica uh, did a lot of singing with her, and then during the you know during Nowruz, no, I can't remember the season, but suddenly there was a lot of demand. It was early summer or the end of at the end of spring, and when the harvest was in, and there was lots of money coming in, and there was lots of demand for uh, uh, women's parties and men's parties and so on. And so Veronica's teacher split the group into two, and her daughter went out as the lead singer, and Veronica joined the her band.
So I want to fast forward a little bit.
Yeah,
After the fall of the Taliban in 2001, you
yeah,
returned to Afghanistan again.
yeah.
I want to know what kind of Afghanistan were you returning to since that era when they banned music and when
Mm.
they fallen, everything was up and running again, the restrictions were lifted. What do you think that their impact had in their first era on musicians?
Well, I made a film about this called Kabul Music Diary, which is we're going to be showing in a couple of days' time at the Royal Anthropological Institute, uh, because I managed to get a grant to return to Afghanistan, to Kabul for a month to investigate the state of music. And I was amazed at the, the rapidity with which musical instruments suddenly appeared in the kind of areas where musical instruments have been sold in the past. And there was a kind of rush of musical activity there. There was a woman, before I made this trip to Kabul, there was a local woman here in Britain I got in contact with. She told me that she had shipped a whole um, cargo of musical instruments. She collected a lot of musical instruments from here, there, everywhere, Western instruments, and then they were all shipped somehow as she got the RAF, the Royal Air Force, to take this load of musical instruments. There's like a huge box full of instruments, and for the university. The university before the Taliban came had a music department, and now that music department had reopened. And so I went, in one scene from this film is where I go to visit the music department, and there are all these instruments, and the head of music there makes a speech to thank Mrs. Sue, as he calls her, was her name, for all these instruments and so on, which were immediately being used and so on. So it was extraordinary how quickly music was returning there, and all the shops, you know, there was an area of Kabul maybe where there were 10, 15, 20 shops in a row. They're all selling musical instruments or hiring them out. Lots of musicians, didn't have the money to buy instruments. So if they had a gig, they go to one of these shops and, hire a harmonium or a rubab or whatever that they needed for the gig that evening.
Mhm.
So there was a tremendous resurgence. There was a lot of interest in what had happened to the archive of music at the radio station. Radio Afghanistan had been a very, very important center for music in the past. It employed, and this is where Karim Dutari had been working, it employed maybe 20, 30 full-time musicians playing different instruments. So there was a return of different kinds of music. There was the return of the kind of the local music that people would perform in small groups, but there was also the return of music on the radio. That's right. There was a lot of interest on the part of people from outside. What happened to this huge tape archive that the radio station had? in the past. And I investigated this, and I was shown how they had managed to hide all the tapes at the radio station from the prying eyes of the Taliban, who were in control of the radio station. So they had saved that collection. Yeah, very important. Music came back very quickly, very quickly. It showed, perhaps because of the war, and perhaps because of the fact that a lot of Afghans had been outside of Afghanistan and got much more used to music being a sort of normal part of life. There was a big resurgence. And also, the Afghans had their kind of pop music. There was a particular singer, I've forgotten his name offhand, but was often described as the Afghan Elvis Presley. you, you roll your eyes.
I'm wondering who that was because I don't think Ahmad Zaire.
Yeah, well, I usually find out, but I
Yeah,
can't.
it's okay.
I don't remember things too quickly. Um, and he wasn't the only one. There were a number of big stars from Radio Afghanistan, and of course, some of them, in due course, when television began to be functional in Afghanistan, because the Taliban, didn't have television. Television was banned, like cinema was largely banned because you're not meant to see people on screen. Um, so that was where they got with that. So many of those stars, made their way to the United States or to Europe, but Afghanistan became a very musical nation, and part of that resurgence of music was the creation of the Dr. Ahmad Sarmast, who had uh, done a PhD in music in, I think, Moscow University, well before the Taliban had arrived, and he started this very important music school in Kabul, the Afghanistan National Institute of Music. So I visited them a few years later as part of my research on the resurgence of music, and there they all are playing Western classical music and new compositions by Afghan composers and so on. So that was a very, and when the Taliban reappeared, 2001, 21, um, many of the students from that school then were um, uh, offered asylum in Portugal, and that school functions to this day in Portugal.
Having witnessed Afghan music across 5 decades, the way that you
Mm.
have, and having it seen change over time, your interest has changed to try and understand the circulation of Afghan music in the transnational community. I want to know what did you learn about how Afghans have kept music alive outside of Afghanistan?
Well, of course, I went to the places where Afghans were to be found. So, for example, my early work in that way was in Fremont, California, and there I found a much more westernized form of Afghan music because the Afghan instruments were not readily available, like dutars and rubabs and so on. So it was much more electric keyboards and drum kits and so on. So it had adapted in that way. Um, and I also, in Australia, visited there, and similar sort of situation. But in all of those various places, Germany, It was also a very important center for Afghan migration. I think, before the Taliban, before all of that, there had been very considerable um, migration of Afghans as workers to Germany, and there was a very substantial Afghan population there. So they had a lot of music of traditional music there, and one or two. I mean, what happens is that in these different environments, a few individuals begin to emerge as being very talented musicians, and they get a lot of work and a lot of fame and popularity, and all these inhibitions about the place of music in human life in the Western circumstance are greatly lessened, if that's a way to put it.
I'm more so leaning to also understand, in your opinion, how does the Afghan diaspora impact the preservation of Afghan music? In my conversations with some young Afghans, there is sort of a desire to keep it alive and having it seen as an obligation to continue to experiment with music, add different elements to it, have an Afghan and English speaker in the same song. What do you make of it?
Oh, well, I haven't come across that precisely, but I can well believe it. And if I went back to Fremont, I'm sure that kind of thing would be going on there. And one of the musicians I worked with in Fremont was very proud that he was the person who had introduced the drum machine into the kind of popular music that he was performing with his harmonium and everything. So there were, plenty of younger musicians who were ready to take on various aspects of Western music and were playing guitars and so on. But of course, there is a sort of an I'm going to say hardcore, but that sounds the wrong term. But there are people who are very keen on their traditional music, and a very good example of that is there's a very good rubab player from Afghanistan who's been in Germany for a number of years, and I'm in touch with him. And several years ago, he sent me a kind of very angry letter saying that he was very furious with um, uh, this international organization. I can't remember exactly the term of it, that was looking at different countries' national musics, and that the rubab was had become the national instrument in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and somewhere else, and Afghanistan almost got left out of the picture altogether. Um, so I then looked at the I just can't remember the name of this. It's a very important international organization. I looked at their documentation regarding the rubab. You can easily find it, and it listed all the places where um, the rubab was being taught and performed, and no mention of Afghanistan at all because of it was Taliban time again. Taliban 2 was back on the scene, and so nothing could be declared about the role of the rubab in Afghanistan as a national instrument.
Mm. That leads to my last question just
Yeah.
before I let you go. We're approaching a 5-year mark now since the Taliban has regained power and has
Mm.
banned music, amongst other restrictions. I want to know from your perspective, what do you make of the ban on music the second time around? And really, in the long term, what do you think is at stake?
Well, I suspect there is a certain amount of music going on. I suspect that there are quite a few people with large collections of cassettes of Afghan music that they're playing here and there. You know, I mean, the Taliban are very keen on having bonfires of musical instruments. You know, had several interviews with Afghans who described, well, we were advised there was going to be the destruction of instruments in the sports stadium, so we went along to see what was going on. But a lot of instruments must have survived, and a lot of music has survived. So I think that the Afghans will be, well, after, I can't believe that this Taliban regime is there for a long, long time. I think there will be a real resurgence of of all forms of music, but particularly the traditional musics, the rubabs, the dutars, the instruments that were played in the past. So that's my dream.
You did say you wanted to show me a little bit of an instrument performance, not a performance, but I
Oh, well, I can
would
play
be
for
happy
you.
to see it. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Bailey. All the
Bye
best.
bye.